organised.
How long is the panel?
Yeah.
Which is a lovely space.
How many people do you have?
Well, like 6.
Hello. No.
Oh, yeah, you did.
I think it's on. Hello. It's like we're running out of time.
Oh, right. He said, oh, wait.
Hello. Hello. Okay. Hello. Hello. Hi.
Actually, the
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah? Okay. We have to lean on it.
Okay, I think we're ready to start the panel discussion. If you haven't finished lunch or you want seconds, please feel free to grab some and sit down with it. But don't. Okay, thank you to all of our panelists, for being here with us. Before we get into our questions, maybe I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and then we can start. Thank you. Catherine first?
Sorry, start in the middle. Hi, I'm Catherine Dunford. I am the Alumni Relations and Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic Engagement Coordinator in Development here at the University of St Andrews. So I am basically working to establish a ethnically and culturally diverse alumni community that you can step into when you graduate.
My name is Ale Bussalem. I'm a lecturer in human geography, so I'm from the School of Geography and Sustainable Development. I am a social and cultural geographer. Specifically, my research sits at the intersection of queer geographies and geographies of race and ethnicity. My PhD was on the experiences of place and space for LGBTQAI+ people of Muslim descent living in Brussels, Belgium, and at the moment I'm working on sense of place and lived experiences for Italians of North African descent. So.
Hi, I'm Conal Treen. I'm a PhD student in modern history. I'm in my 4th year now, so just trying to write up my thesis and get it done. I'm also a collections assistant with the University Museum. My research in particular focuses on the history of the Bell Pettigrew Museum and the Natural Science Collection at St Andrews, looking at its imperial and colonial legacies. I'm very interested in objects that have come from Australia and New Zealand in particular, so I look at the history of how natural history and settler colonialism often intersected. And I'm also currently working on a project with the museum to recover a lot of the provenance information of its natural science collection.
Perfect. Thank you. So I think we'll start with a couple of questions that we had prepared, and like if anyone from the audience wants to ask something, we can keep this quite informal. Just raise your hand and make a comment and we can have a conversation. So the first question that we kind of discussed, keeping in theme with the whole voices unheard kind of question, is how do the concepts of Orientalism and othering intersect with issues of environmental justice and conservation? I guess this would be relevant to Conal and Ale. Yeah.
Would you like to go first?
Would you?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, so this is a really interesting question that actually relates a lot with my current PhD research. So my research is kind of split into 2 key areas. One looking at the sort of colonial context in which objects were acquired within Australia and New Zealand, and the other looking at the sort of imperial context of how they were used within St Andrews itself. In particular, I pay attention to 19th and 20th century zoological education, so looking at the natural sciences in St Andrews and what students during that period learned about the natural world. And I think from that research, some really interesting themes started to emerge, specifically thinking about how fauna from Australia and New Zealand were seen within zoological education. That sort of education was very much based on looking at European nature to tell universal truths about the natural world. So animals from Australia and New Zealand were typically othered and seen as unnatural compared to European nature. And from this point of view, I find it really interesting that these students in St Andrews, learning about the sort of colonial nature within Britain's empire, many of them would end up in environmental professions within these countries, including New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, mainly relating to the fisheries industry, which is related to St Andrews' tradition of marine biology. But that's on the side. So I think this process of othering animals like platypuses and echidnas, which are sort of marsupials and monotremes, they were seen as evolutionary inferior compared to the sort of placental mammals found in Britain and Scotland during that period. And even in New Zealand, the sort of flightless birds, which are very characteristic of that region, were seen as sort of degenerative sort of creatures. So essentially, these animals were kind of seen as living fossils which had somehow survived massive extinction events and seen as peculiar and unnatural. And from this sort of starting point, I begin to sort of look into how fauna in these regions and the rationalizations of their displacement, so the processes of extinction that have characterized Australia and New Zealand, we use to inform imperial ideologies about the displacement of indigenous peoples. During this period, many indigenous peoples were seen as fauna, which obviously discredited their sovereignty and claims to ownership of the land, if they were part of it. And I think this is a sort of these discourses and how we describe the natural world within Australia and New Zealand are legacies that still circulate within scientific education today. And looking through objects, textbooks, and even images, you can see how these sort of themes come out, especially how Kiwis in New Zealand are often compared to the extinct moa species. That's diving heavily into my research, but I would certainly argue that we definitely need to address these legacies in education today, and especially how we sort of talk about the natural world. And museums are very, very emblematic of this. It's seen through a scientific lens, where other cultural perspectives and indigenous ontologies are often erased or ignored. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, but I'm going to have to follow up with that.
So environment and environmental justice is not something that I would, these are not words that I would have described to, that I would have used to describe my, my research. But I am increasingly thinking in terms of sustainabilities, in terms of environmental aspects of race, racialization, ethnicity, and of queerness, because of necessity really, and because those are the conversations that are happening around us. And there are two directions in which I am currently thinking together with colleagues, so I'm just going to briefly outline those two. The first one is about differential impacts of environmental change and climate change. And as a geographer, I'm particularly interested in the where that happens. So who are the people, the humans, that are most exposed at the moment to environmental change? And we can speak about disasters, but we can also think, well, in our cities, what are the parts that are the most vulnerable to flooding? Or who are the communities that are most exposed to pollutants? Recent research says that a lot of people in the UK don't have access or they don't live in proximity of any green or blue area, and we know that that has an impact on mental and physical health, a positive impact on mental physical health. So going and looking at where are those impacts most felt and who lives, who inhabits those places that are more vulnerable. So who are the communities? What are the intersections between processes specifically of racialization, but also of class assignation and health and environmental change. So that's one line of interrogation that interests me. The other one has a lot to do with what with this distinction between natural and natural, and with how structures of power divide and create discrete categories of natural and unnatural. And in here I'm thinking about queer ecologies and queer and trans ecologies, which are really having a moment in geography and in cognate disciplines. What does it mean to problematize what we mean as natural and unnatural from the point of view and perspective of communities of people that have, for most of history, been framed as against nature at worst, and out of nature, out of what is natural at best? What is the perspective that a queer approach can give us into problematizing and into blurring the boundaries between what is natural, what is unnatural? What are the ways of relating to nature of queer communities? What are the solidarities between these approaches and these views of nature to indigenous ontologies, anti-settler ways of, or not anti-settler, but decolonial ways of viewing relationship with landscapes and with natures of different kinds. So these are a bit, I mean, there is a lot there, but these are the two directions in which I feel like I am thinking at the moment in terms of these questions.
Thank you. Kathleen, did you want to come in on this?
Sorry, was that me? So I'm just thinking about some of the work that I've been involved in sort of pre-pandemic around environmental justice and facilitating movements or empowering people who are seeking to protect indigenous knowledge, so indigenous seed banks, indigenous agriculture, and how those movements particularly face significant struggles when it comes to even accessing or occupying space that renders them valid in the eyes of the status quo, so the power holders. And so when I'm thinking about what you're saying, theoretically there is so much discussion about how can we look back, how can we decolonize, how can we make life more just. Actually, some of these movements face such significant battles in terms of just existing, so just to actually exist. And this plays out for us too. It's really hard for us to separate the the monetization of identity, of rights, of access to land, to knowledge, to culture. And this is a battle that we're facing on a very personal level, on an individual level, when we access each other's stories in spaces of education where there is a transaction ongoing with an institution, when we go into our work, when we go into our jobs. So I guess from my perspective, I'm thinking of how this is something really real that is being faced, yes, by people who are at the coalface of protecting their cultural identity or trying to claw that back from, say, industrial agriculture, or find ways to preserve heritage in the face of a man-made climate disaster. But it also plays out very real, in a realistic way for us as individuals when we're trying to make our communities, because the way that we're engaging with each other is informed by this history of what is natural, or what is right, or where are the terms of engagement. And that's not often spoken about or elucidated or actually named directly. So this is really important. It's a really important way to look at, particularly at St Andrews, looking at the way that the things that we have, where they came from, how did we get them? It all forms part of how you interact with each other, and when you leave, how you have a frame of reference for each other in the context of how is it that we have a globe that is so skewed to what is and isn't natural. So I'm really pleased to hear that this kind of work is happening in St Andrews, where we're actually trying to identify how we can how we can learn from the movements that are occurring to understand what happened in the past, because it is still playing out very much on a personal level. Even though sometimes it feels like it's so far away, like, oh, it's some community in Ecuador that is fighting for their seed bank. Actually, that plays into the food that you're buying in the grocery store, or the way that you interact with someone when you're approaching finding your first job, right? So yeah, from a very praxis point of view, these are discussions that are really important because they inform the way that we're actually practically interacting with each other and seeking justice in our own interactions and the way that we're building our communities.
Thank you. Do you guys have anything to follow up with, or I can ask another one?
I think the next question will be very pertinent. So thank you so much for your answers. I was particularly taken by sort of how you all mentioned the importance to be informed in different ways, and so how to gather this knowledge. And because museums have been mentioned, I was wondering if this is a question open to all of you, if we can talk about how museums perhaps could historicize or sort of acknowledge histories of racism and knowledge of indigenous people, and how that fits into the conversation in San Andreas specifically, but even globally. That's an open question to everyone.
Well, I'm happy to take this one.
Yeah, lovely.
This is something which I kind of live and breathe at the moment through my thesis and through my work with the museum. So one of the key aspects of my research is, as I said, looking at the context of collecting in colonial Australia and New Zealand, and specifically identifying the role of Indigenous peoples through natural history collecting and the production of scientific knowledge. If you've been to any natural history museum in the UK, you will notice that it is very skewed towards histories of white gentlemen who have gone out and claimed specimens and made new discoveries about the natural world. But there's a rising scholarship as well as an effort within museums to acknowledge the role of Indigenous peoples, who were often considered as assistants to these white Europeans, but were nonetheless incredibly important in how Europeans were able to identify and learn about the natural world within these colonial spaces. So my approach to this sort of history is to acknowledge two sort of key areas. The first is definitely that perspective on the role of Indigenous peoples within the history of science, acknowledging how their knowledge and expertise was used to advance scientific understanding about the natural world. But I would also argue that we need to pay attention to moments of Indigenous agency and autonomy. And so this often kind of requires a reframing of these cross-cultural encounters where natural history wasn't just to the benefit of white Europeans, but it was also to the benefit of Indigenous peoples who used collecting in order to survive within settler colonial contexts, in order to acquire provisions or actually money in return of their labour and knowledge. This didn't often happen. Often the sort of negotiations over labour and wages were just sort of omitted from scientific texts, which is a very prominent theme in the history of science. But it certainly provokes a consideration about how our museums are built upon this legacy and this history where Indigenous peoples were incredibly valuable. The other perspective that I really want to acknowledge is how natural history collecting and scientific inquiry overlapped with colonial power structures, and especially how naturalists within these contexts appropriated colonial infrastructure and the inequalities which define settler colonialism to exploit Indigenous knowledge as well. So on the one hand, there are these sort of two conflicting things of Indigenous autonomy and also the colonial structures where Indigenous peoples were trying to survive in. A really good example of this, and it's one of my favourite objects, there's a frilled lizard from Australia, which isn't in our collection. It once was, but it's now in the National Museums of Scotland. This was acquired during the 1890s by John Patterson Blair. Blair was a St Andrean, a Scottish migrant who went to Queensland and worked as an engineer on a sugar mill in Queensland. Unfortunately, he has left no record of how he acquired this specimen, which is incredibly frustrating. But my research methodologies effectively broadens the sort of contextual lens to this moment of acquisition, looking at other naturalists within this area. And the significance of him collecting on this sugar plantation opens up this whole sort of fascinating colonial history. Queensland at this point was importing unfree labour from Pacific Islands. So Pacific Islanders were sometimes forcibly kidnapped and brought to Queensland to work on these sugar plantations. Aboriginal Australian peoples were also forced onto cattle stations in order to carry out labour and further settler colonial endeavours. But what's really interesting is some of these naturalists based at these sugar plantations, in their diaries, they're frequently recording exchanges with Pacific Islanders. So Islanders during this period were referred to with the racial slur of Kanaka, and there were racial ideas about how Islanders were valuable for labour because they could work within tropical environments. But these diaries reveal that often they were bringing specimens to these naturalists in order to sort of have this exchange and be paid for their services as well. But also, what my research has uncovered is these islanders were also autonomous outside of the plantation system. They were going regularly on hunting trips, they were maintaining connections with kin and friends on other sugar plantations, and really this sort of the natural history was just to put it in very basic terms, a side gig to their efforts to survive within Queensland settler society. So this is a really excellent example of the potential that our museum collections can relate to these wider histories, but it requires a lot of effort, and I think this will probably be another question to come up a bit later about how we go about addressing these histories and making them visible within our museums. Sorry to ramble on.
No, that's lovely, thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in, or do we have any questions from the audience maybe?
I just wanted to also say, I know that a lot of this also applies to natural history, but also like slightly relevant, but I have been to the St. Andrews Museum, the University Museum, and I remember being very surprised by an exhibit that was talking about like the history of our own institution and like the inclusion of women. So like I think the reason we don't have graduation caps is because when women were let into the university, a couple of men threw their caps into the sea, and ever since we've just not had them, which is an interesting like history at an institution that we all are kind of a part of, that I feel like should be more sort of acknowledged, and I think that's an interesting like aspect of like museums as well, because a lot of it is an institution trying to make peace with its own history. Mm-hmm. So that's something to. Anyway, question. Is that a question? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if there are any other questions, I can go first. But I was kind of interested in like that idea that you brought up, and I think it's run its course through all of the student speakers as well. This idea of how we present this history. I know the woman, I apologize, I forget her name, who presented on colonialism and how we should present that and whether controversy should be available to see in museums. I'd love y'all's take on that, since that museum culture does seem to be kind of a consistent dialogue throughout all of these talks, and it was something that you brought up and that I'm curious about.
You go first.
Okay. So, sorry, just to reiterate, the specific question was how to present these histories within museums. Yeah, I think this is a really important issue that I'm trying to work through myself, especially both being outside of the museum and within it. And it's, I don't think it just comes down to sort of changing the displays. You know, the Bell Pettigrew Museum, for example, is an Edwardian zoological teaching museum. It's incredibly rigid in what you can do with that space and the narratives that you can convey, because it's already laid out in this sort of scientific lens about how to interpret the natural world, which is to an extent uncompromising in including different indigenous ontologies. I also feel that change has to occur throughout the structure of the museum as well. It's not just about how to sort of make these histories visible, but it's also down to sort of cataloguing and how to make these histories accessible as well. Often going through the museum catalogues, it's almost impossible to find terms like colonialism or imperialism or empire, not to mention sort of indigenous names and ontologies also. And one of my main projects with the museum is, it's called the Bell Pettigrew Provenance Project. So during the 1970s, the natural science specimens were reorganized and all their original labels were stripped away and placed with scientific labels that emphasize their distribution. So donor names, places that they were collected, the dates as well, all identifiers relating to this broader imperial and colonial history were erased. Perhaps not intentionally, like it's obviously that museum had scientific intentions during that period, but we're at a point where we want to address these histories now. So much of that information was recorded on documentation and shoved in the special collection. I just so happened to come across it and now are working through that documentation, trying to match provenance data back to those objects. But one of the things I was thinking about is, no, it's one thing to have all this information back on our databases, but how do we enable collaboration with other indigenous communities and letting them know what objects are in our collection and what potential those objects have in telling those histories as well. So I think, yeah, in terms of both telling these histories, both through reinterpretation and display, I think it does require collaboration with indigenous communities. And it's a long process, and it's more than just sort of recovering this information, it's trying to make it that valuable, not for the museum itself, but for other communities out there.
I guess I have a question for you, a rhetorical question. When did you first experience a museum, or experience a place of collection of artifacts? So I think back to this for myself, like the first time I experienced a museum in my little hometown in Africa. And it was a museum full of things from where I came from, right? So it felt like a place that I could identify because those things related to my world. And my first experience of being in a Western museum was not the same. Right? I got to see things from different places. Skip forward many moons, there came a point in my life when entering into a museum felt like not a positive experience. I was now in a space that felt a little haunted, that this was a place where things were taken from other places and brought here for me to look at. Some of these things were special and sacred. Some of these things were taken in context that I don't know the context in which this clay jar or this mask was removed from this community, and here I am looking at it behind glass. And then I come to the point, so now I struggle with museums. I did my PhD here, so Bell Pettigrew is really, it's something I know really well, right? But I've not been back into it because I struggle with places that hold formerly living things or artifacts from other places. And I think this is something that a lot of indigenous communities, we say indigenous communities, people around the world are saying, give us our things back. And there's a very good reason for that, because in many cultures, collecting things is not the way you do it. So for instance, I guess I'm coming down to, when was the first time you went into a museum and what was it like? So I grew up in a colony, a former colony, born very soon after independence. So my local museum was very much a British museum, even though it was filled with things from the local community. So what is natural and what's not natural? Okay? And so we are collecting things that are natural, and we're putting them in buildings, and we're coming to see them. But who says that they are natural? And who says that the process of collecting things is natural? Why are we doing this? What is the reason that we are collecting things? Who are we collecting things for? So, I'm not coming for you. But I want to say this: that when we're saying to community, we call indigenous community, we're speaking to communities around the world and saying, we have your things here, let's talk about it. Actually, maybe they want their things back. Maybe they don't collect things. So museums themselves are so oppressive and colonial. They are for collecting others. They're for collecting other people's things. They collect bones of other people. They collect animals, which, growing up in my hometown, I could go outside and see those animals or see those rocks. I didn't need to collect them. So who are we collecting them for and why? So we're collecting them and transporting them so that people can see them, so they can see how others live and exist, or the way others look. So why are we doing this? I think that's a really important thing when we're talking about the artifacts that we have, or how we talk about the stories and the narratives. The whole system is other. It others everything except the viewpoint of those who are collecting and the reasons they are collecting. And so when you're doing this work, when you're talking about other people's artifacts, other people's history, other people's sacred body parts, people's sacred, in many cultures, for instance, I'm sure from my experience in New Zealand, when a volcano erupts and a village is covered, it is no longer accessible to anyone. There is no excavation, there is no retrieving of artifacts. This is now sacred land. And yet, this is something that we would not think twice about. We go and open graves in Egypt. We don't go open our own graves, right? In the UK, we don't go to graveyards and dig up and see what people were buried with, but we go to Egypt and do that. So we need to think about, why are we collecting? Who are we collecting for? And when we're telling these stories, that is the burden that we carry with us when we tell the stories of those objects. That they were collected with a certain mindset for a certain purpose. So in doing that, how do we do justice now to the fact that I'm holding this object, I'm telling this object story? I think that's really, really, really important. Because it's not natural to go around collecting stuff and putting it in a room and then showing it to people. Unless you live somewhere where there is nothing. And I think most people who grew up in Britain would say there are plenty of things in Britain to see if you go outside. So why do we need to collect them somewhere? So again, for me, there's a bit of this power play, a control of social narrative, a control of the way that the power dynamic plays out in society. I've collected some stuff so you can come and see it. I hold this, I own it, it's worth something, right? You are other, this is how we do natural things and unnatural things, all this categorization. So I guess this is my call to say, when you are doing this work, to be really careful with it and be mindful that it is from a perspective that is not everybody's natural inclination.
I think that there is, and just a tiny thing that I would like to add. I was thinking, as I was hearing the answers, about museums as sites of power and how do we see power manifest. And I think it is a bit limiting sometimes to think of museums as a space that is representative of a certain group of people that just put the institution there. There are some things that we go and see, and that is the only power that is manifested, or the only agency that is manifested there. I think sometimes what interests me the most about museums is actually not what is collected, but it is, what do people do with it? How do people contest that collection? How do people occupy that space? How do people interrogate themselves over what other narratives can we give? Do we need the museum in the first place? I think that as a container of all these dynamics, that's quite interesting. So recently, while I was doing fieldwork in Italy, I went to MUDEC in Milan, which is Museo delle Culture, which was the attempt that I can agree with, to basically re-articulate the whole ethnographic and anthropological collection of the old Ethnography Museum of Milan in a new way. By new way, I mean that the last room, which was the most interesting to me, is entirely dedicated to racialized people in Milan. So it's all people of color, artists of color doing work representing what it means to be an Italian, and what we would call second generation, especially in Italian. So people of racialized descent, or racialized people of migratory descent. Super interesting. As I was starting my visit in the museum, and the beginning of the museum that leads you there, it's all a history that reformulates all the artifacts around the history in which Milan as a city is part of global problematic exchanges, so dealing with the complicities in the enslavement of people and in the trade of enslaved people, etc., etc., demystifying about the history of Milan that was taking place. As I was walking, I can hear this young tour guide that is an official tour guide of the museum talking to a bunch of kids, not all of them white. I read them to be between 5 and 8, but I'm very bad at guessing age of children, so they could be whatever. And I hear in this silent room, there is just me, this tour guide, this kids, everyone is having a good time, and I hear something along the lines, and what is something that you really enjoy having on your table when you have a snack? And it was chocolate, and the explanation for why they could enjoy chocolate was that these men went so far, far away to get our chocolate for us. And I was just like, in this room, and I was like, what is going on here? But this, I think, is what is interesting about how power works and about how different people occupying a space that is important because because we're giving it importance and we're giving it meaning. Otherwise, it would just be like a set of walls with some stuff in it. Mm-hmm. But because we're giving it importance, then what happens in there, the stories that are being told, and how they're being told on the walls about the artifacts by the people that crossed there. Because in there was also another important actor, which was me. And I was conducting research from an anti-racist perspective as a second generation, as an Italian person, mixed race of Moroccan descent, that was also in that space and that was also hearing that. And that I'm now retelling you that episode and that anecdote in a problematizing way. I am part of that space too. Now, as I was then when I was listening. And I think that that is an important way of thinking about museums or about places of cultural production and reproduction in general. We are part of them. So maybe when I was hearing the question, how should we present things? Maybe it's not about getting to a state in which we're satisfied with how things are presented, but with really fostering the conversation and sometimes the tension around the need to present, to represent. What is it that we're doing? What are these walls? That's what interests me a lot about museums.
Sorry? Yeah, okay. One last question.
Sorry.
But I just wanted to say, just down the road in East Weems, just past Leven, so like 15 minutes from here really, is are a series of caves that have Pictish glyphs, and it's actually the largest group of those glyphs that are in any one place. And I'm sure the voice is unheard. I'm sure no one else has heard of these, right? And it's an amazing cultural treasure that is a complete mystery, right? The Pictish people are historically indigenous people here that left very little historical record, and so we don't understand their history. And I just wanted to mention it because it kind of stands in opposition to a museum, right? There's no presentation there. In fact, it's under threat of erosion because it's right on the sea, and it's like there could be an environmental catastrophe if those were lost to tides. And when one goes there, there's no presentation, right? You're left with just a mystery and a question mark. And so I just wanted to kind of mention it because it's right here on our doorstep, and it's I highly recommend anyone go see it. And I think it questions, it brings up the question of we go to a museum to find history, but there are, that's already, as you say, a representation, like we're presenting that history. So I guess wonder, what are the other places where we can go to experience those, that history in a way that is, that leaves those some of the problematic, tendencies behind. Yeah. Yeah.
Just this is a very relevant question, and also I think sometimes it confronts us with the fact that it's easier in a way to recognize the museum, for example, as a problematic space, because there is an intention, there is a narrative that is being presented. We can pinpoint it, we can, something that is different and that geographers have tried to do for a long time is how are those meanings and histories inscribed in landscape, which is something that we feel as much more, quote unquote, natural, right? So what does the Scottish outdoors mean in terms of what class meanings are assigned to certain activities that we're used to consider as appropriate in the Scottish Highlands? Whose bodies are included, whose bodies are not included? What colonial histories are inscribed in the landscape itself, in the species that we see, in the plants, in the non-human animals that we see, or those that we don't see anymore because they're not there? And I do think that that's harder to do because it's not as clear as someone has put a series of objects in a certain order. These objects are from elsewhere and it's telling a story about it. But there is that story, and I think that testament to that is that some people don't feel so comfortable in those landscapes. And this doesn't answer the question, right? but I think it adds an element to it, which is like, sometimes we also need to ask ourselves what are the representations that are happening in things that we are considering intact from human hands or will.
Yeah. Sorry that this was our bad. We should have scheduled a longer time for the discussion. But yeah. I think we're ready to wrap up. I think Megan's going to say a few words.
So thank you so much, first of all, to our lovely panel. We appreciate having you here. We only got to touch a third of what we were going to discuss.
Yeah.
We've got the room until 1:30, so if you want to stay and discuss in the back, have a coffee, I'm sure if you have time. But thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to our lovely speakers. We really appreciate you having every single one of you here, and we learned a lot from you. Our keynote speaker, Fabio, is amazing. Thank you so much for him. Thank you to these three here, backbone of the event. Thank you to Educom and obviously all the school presidents that come with it. Thank you to the BSN members that helped. Thank you to the EDI Fund who helped fund your little lunch for today and the rest of our proceedings. I think that's all my thank yous.
Yeah.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, what's also really interesting is that going forward, like going backwards, how we deal with connections, how we do justice in that sense. Also going forward, like how is it that we do microspaces, we do analyse, we do find ways to sort of understand how it didn't work in the past, it wasn't natural in the past. How can it be more natural? Like who is and who isn't. I think that's such a looking back. I think that's sometimes helping we don't actually fix the problems
And it's just so funny that the university always espouses these ideas of equality and representation. I feel like it hasn't translated through into museum spaces. All the spaces, all the traits right here. That doesn't tell the whole story about St. Andrew's. It's a very specific narrative.
This was really fun.
how much I nodded. Yeah, the real thing we talked about yesterday. Do we need to do that's one thing.
We'll send it out to you guys. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, that's also
Why is this happening? We're trying to make it break it. Like, yes.